He didn't need to touch me to leave me in ruins. All it took was a fleeting glance, a whispered comment about Gothic architecture, or a brief crooked smile at the corner of his mouth. Always there, at the end of the library corridor, as if he were part of the ancient collection I knew by heart. And maybe he was. Benjamin Moore was old in his ideas and young in his ways. Everything about him seemed to contain layers, like good books you reread even when you know the ending. Subscribe to the channel and give it a like to get access to more stories like this. My name is James Carter, I'm 30 years old, and until recently, I had never kissed anyone. Not for lack of opportunities, maybe, or lack of desire, but because something in me always froze right before the touch. An internal voice, stubborn and cruel, told me that no one would truly see me. I grew up quiet, the type who goes unnoticed, the type who never misses deadlines, never talks loud, never dares to ask for what they want. Becoming a librarian was almost ironic. Me, someone who spent my life organizing other people's stories, too full of my own to even start. Staying a virgin until 30 seemed just a consequence of a pattern. While colleagues were living it up at parties, having romances, experiencing love crises, I built a fortress of routine, hiding any sign of interest in other men under layers of silence. Not exactly shame, more like fear of being seen, and even more, of not being seen back. But there was something else. Something that pushed me even further from the ordinary world. My touch. Literally. Since I was 24, I developed something I could never quite explain. If I touch someone, I hear their thoughts. Clear, crisp, as if I'd walked into a room with no doors. In practice, I became a hermit in a social anthill. A simple handshake revealed betrayals, lies, insecurities. I discovered that people think much more than they say, and 90% of those things are hard to stomach. Avoiding touches became as much a part of my routine as making morning tea or aligning books by cataloging themes. But Benjamin wasn't like the others, and some ancient instinct in me knew that sooner or later, our paths would intertwine. What I didn't know was how much it would transform me. What you hear here is just the beginning. The complete stories, unfiltered, and with all the details you can imagine, are available now. Check the link in the description right away. The university library is in an old building, with colonial architecture preserved as a silent legacy of a time no one mentions. Marble floors, dark wooden shelves, and long windows with heavy curtains that filter the morning light as if time were too lazy to pass. I've been part of these corridors for almost 8 years. Every corner is familiar to me, from the padded benches under the literature section window to the stair railing that creaks discreetly on the second floor. I knew the names of almost all the regulars, even without exchanging more than essential words. My routine was simple and careful. Arrive before 8, unlock the doors, warm up my thermos with chamomile tea, review the previous night's returns. Then, I'd wander through sections with a leather-bound notebook, jotting down adjustments, checking catalogs, avoiding any and all physical interaction. My gloves weren't just for not ruining old papers. They protected me from myself. The calm of the days became almost background music. Most students came and went in predictable cycles, rarely stopping to notice the discreet figure sitting at the counter with eyes always alert and distant. I preferred it that way. Discretion gave structure to my existence. But that September, autumn seemed determined to bring down more than just leaves. It was as if September had a plan. And it started with Benjamin Moore's arrival. I don't remember exactly what he was wearing on the first day, but I remember the way he took up space, as if the world had never told him no. It was Mrs. Lewis, the coordinator, who told me, "New art history professor, just met him. He's going to live here with you." She laughed with her usual mocking air. Good luck. And he came. Benjamin walked in every day as if he belonged, carrying piles of notes, worn folders, books with pen annotations, and a faint smell of ink and leather. His steps were deliberate, but not hurried. He liked to rummage through old shelves, read introductions, and ask questions. Lots of questions. Sometimes he'd play soft instrumental music while working, and hum opera excerpts as he drank coffee. Not just any coffee. Strong, black coffee, boiling in his veins just like the words that said a lot and kept even more. In the first few days, my focus was simple: keep my distance. But Benjamin was one of those rare people who effortlessly disarm others. He had charisma that seeped through his pores, and he seemed genuinely interested in the place, in the library's structure, in the separate system I'd created for the rarest books. He praised me discreetly, like someone who recognizes art where few see it. And in that moment, something in me wanted to give in. It wasn't immediate, but it came. A quieter Thursday, late afternoon, leaves falling outside like relics in the air. He came up beside me and said, "James, hey, did you know we have an original copy of the first edition of Piranesi's essays?" My body froze. The question was innocent, but he was holding my arm. Not tightly, but contact, skin on skin. It was like falling into a bottomless pit. In my mind, the sound came as a disorganized symphony. I thought I'd hear something casual, a mental note about books. But what I got was different. That mouth of his, the way he frowns. Why am I so attracted to that? He's handsome without knowing it. That's the worst part. Does he notice my heart races when he gets close? My legs weakened under the desk. I disguised it, subtly pulled my arm away, and pretended to be distracted by a pile of index cards. Benjamin recoiled, perhaps noticing my discomfort. But there, in that split second, I discovered something I could no longer deny. He saw me, not just as a library employee, not just as a book organizer, as a man, as a possibility. And I was starting to see the same thing. From that accidental touch, our dynamic gained a new layer, a latent tension, like electricity running beneath the wall, invisible but real. The following days were a subtle build-up. He kept coming, as always, but his gaze lingered longer on mine. Instead of formal questions, he brought subtle comments about European cinema, paintings that evoked the silence of solitude, topics that seemed random, but directly touched me. We started sharing small tasks. He'd help me realign old maps, clean covers of volumes dating back to the 19th century, digitize visual references of forgotten works. Sometimes he'd bring an apple pie from his favorite bakery to share at lunch, even though he usually ate alone in a back room. The conversation flowed easily, unforced. There was a kindness in his gestures, a care for silences that made me lower my walls little by little. I noticed a quiet passion in him for everything imperfect. Books with worn edges, black and white photos, scratched film. And I began to realize that maybe he looked at me exactly like that, as something imperfect, but valuable. I never touched him again. I was afraid of what else I might hear. But just watching him was almost like not breathing properly. For weeks, I only sighed when he left. It was my mind's way of holding onto the feeling that was growing without asking permission. But there was one thing pounding day after day, that old voice inside me repeating that this wasn't for me, that I was just a phase, an object of curiosity, a fleeting nod in a sea of options for someone like him. And then, she appeared. Rebecca Miller, lawyer, ex-girlfriend, the woman who, according to rumors, almost married Benjamin before he disappeared from public life for a few months and reappeared as a university professor. She showed up on a cloudy afternoon, with a posture too elegant for the library, and that presence that destabilizes even the ground beneath you. I saw them talking across the reading room. They were laughing softly. He seemed tense. She, too comfortable. When Benjamin's eyes met mine across the room, I saw something there. A plea for patience, regret, confusion. Everything in me seemed to darken. If he was still caught up in that story, if that connection hadn't been broken, how could I compete? Maybe my first love was also my first collapse. And worse, I knew what he was thinking. I just needed to be brave enough to touch him one more time and hear what I couldn't bear. But it wasn't time yet. The time was coming, and it would taste of truth. The library closed at 8 that Monday. The storm predicted for early evening didn't come, and instead of rain, a muggy heat settled in. Benjamin stayed late. He said he needed to finish some corrections on his lesson plans. A lie. He didn't need to stay. I knew, and he knew that I knew. I stayed at the counter finishing the review of loan requests when I heard his footsteps approaching slowly, unhurriedly, as if he were walking straight towards an answer he had been waiting for days. James. He said my full name. Not J, not J. The correct name. The complete word in the mouth of the man who made me dizzy. I didn't answer. I looked up and saw him standing in front of me, holding a thick, dark blue book he'd picked up earlier. Eyes downcast, but posture firm. I had a feeling this was the point where something would change. Forever. "Can I ask you a question?" I nodded. My throat was dry. The lights in the main hall had already been turned off, and the back section was darker than usual. He gently placed the book on the counter, as if depositing a secret, and then said, without beating around the bush, "Why do you keep pulling away from me?" The question was direct, and because of that, it disarmed me. I took a deep breath. The seconds stretched out as if time were pretending not to be present. "Because you make me too vulnerable," I murmured. "And I don't know how to deal with that." He looked at me for a long time, in silence, as if he had been waiting for that answer for weeks. "I feel vulnerable around you too. And maybe that's what I like most." I felt my legs tremble. I ran a hand over my glasses, a silly gesture to hide the internal turmoil. I wanted to look away, but he kept staring at me, steady. There was something in his eyes that said, "It's now." "Is it true what you heard that day?" he finally asked. "In that touch?" For the first time, we dared to name it, to talk about it. I nodded silently. "Yes," I replied. "I heard everything." "Then let me show you the rest," he said, and he held out his hand. I stared at his open palm, presented before me, and for a second I was gripped by an old fear, but also by a new curiosity, an undeniable urge to stop running. I extended my own hand with the care of someone learning to touch something very fragile. Our fingers met, and I heard nothing, nothing. No thoughts invading my head, no words, no anguish, no veiled desires, just silence. A calm silence like a lake at dusk, a kind of peace I had never experienced with any other touch. I looked up, startled. "You turned it off?" He smiled. He shrugged slightly. "Maybe I learned to be silent inside, when it's for your good." I felt a pang in the center of my chest, a pang of affection, and something I later recognized as relief. That was the sign. I could trust. I moved closer slowly. The room was almost dark, only an emergency light partially illuminating the rare books section. Without saying a word, I walked beside him to behind the ancient history shelf where no one would see us. The world seemed to shrink in that instant, fitting entirely between the two of us. He placed his hands on my waist, but didn't pull me in. He just held me in place, as if he wanted to confirm I was there. And yes, I was. More present than I had ever been in my entire life. It was the touch on my face that made time stop. His fingers traced my jawline with the delicacy of someone leafing through the preface of a rare book. He didn't rush the movement, just touched, looked, memorized. I closed my eyes for the first time, and let my body respond. When our lips finally met, it was unlike anything I had ever imagined. There was no explosion, no urgency. It was like sinking into a warm bath after a whole winter. The world outside completely disappeared. All that mattered was the warmth he left against my mouth, his scent filling the air, clean, with a slight hint of spice and old paper, and the way his hands knew exactly where to stop and where to explore. My shirt slowly rode up through his fingers, which discovered my skin like someone opening an old letter and reading it with reverence. With each new touch, my body learned that pleasure didn't just come from the flesh, but from being seen, being cared for, being desired with intention. There, between that shelf and the entire world that seemed suspended, he stripped me of fear. He didn't need to rush. Benjamin was made of details. When his hand touched me, I felt 1,000 bells ringing deep in my mind. But it wasn't noise, it was presence. It was living intensity running beneath the surface. His breath on my neck was like a new language, and my body responded with a language of its own. Involuntary, surrendered, honest. We undressed each other with the care of someone disassembling armor. There was no direct light there, but I saw every one of his movements, as if they were scenes projected inside my head. Lingering kisses on my stomach, circular touches that drew promises on my hips, hands that held me with respect and firmness. They were unhurried gestures, firm and conscious, as if he were reading me with his hands. And he was reading me, deciphering me completely. My body didn't know how to do that. Never had. But in that moment, there was no right or wrong. There were our mouths finding paths, our bodies talking without grammar, our low moans mixing with the muffled sound of the motionless spines around us. When he enveloped me completely, it was like opening the last page of a book and realizing the ending was worth the wait. Our bodies fit together with rare harmony. The warmth of his skin made mine breathe. And there, in that almost sacred space in a place where silence was the rule, I made love for the first time. Without shame, without fear, without doubt. It was like being written for the first time, and signed where before I only saw blank space. Our bodies stayed pressed together for a while afterward, sweaty and calm, breathing as if we were trying to synchronize reality with what had just happened. The emergency light still flickered dimly in the background. We were next to the global history shelf now, on the cold floor covered by our haphazard clothes. The silence didn't bother us. It was comfortable, dense, but calm. Benjamin rested his head on my shoulder and just stayed there, simply feeling. "I waited a long time for this," he whispered. "Me too." "More than you can imagine," I replied, staring at the ceiling without really seeing it. I spent a few minutes trying to reorganize my thoughts. My body was still vibrating, but the most impressive thing was what came from within. A kind of calm contentment, an instant maturity, as if all the pieces of my life now made sense. I no longer felt virgin. It wasn't about technique, nor about the act itself. It was about having experienced something complete, something deeply human, something finally mine. I turned to him, lying on my side. "Did you hear what I was thinking all that time?" I asked. He smiled slightly, lazily. He touched my chest with one hand. "No, but I felt you. The whole time." I closed my eyes. The fear hadn't disappeared. It still lived inside me, in some dark corner of my mind. But now I knew I could face it. Because for the first time, I wasn't alone. The intimacy we built there, that night, wasn't just about desire. It was about trust. About allowing myself to be vulnerable without falling apart. About giving and receiving in return. We dressed in silence, helping each other with simple gestures. He hugged me before leaving. Strong, tight, long. And he said, before crossing the door, "You're not a phase, James." And I wanted to believe him. I was ready to try. The days that followed the night between Benjamin and me weren't what I expected. There was no movie romance, no candlelit dinners, or sweet notes hidden between books. The truth is, reality came knocking the very next morning, and the sound of that knock had a name. Rebecca Miller. She appeared as if she already knew exactly where she was going. Beautiful, obviously. One of those beauties that seemed to have been sculpted by Renaissance artists. Everything in place, no unnecessary gestures, no wasted words. A woman with presence and purpose. I watched from afar as she entered the library. Steady steps, firm heels. Benjamin was in the restricted consultation room. I could see him through the glass. And I also saw when she saw him, and smiled. A smile from someone who knows the other's flaws, who has slept on the right side of the bed, and knew he always kicked off the covers at night. She walked in. The door closed. There was no argument, no tears, just calm gestures and long minutes of conversation. It was enough time for me to almost destroy everything we had built. Insecurity consumed me in seconds. I was devoured by thoughts hammering on a loop. What if he's just confused? What if I'm just a distraction? What if she's the love of his life, and I'm just a temporary stop along the way? The problem with living alone for so long is that your mind learns to be both your own voice and your worst enemy. That afternoon, I avoided looking Benjamin in the eyes. I avoided touching anything that still smelled of him. I avoided being. I locked the door to the old archives room and breathed there for almost 20 minutes, as if the air between cardboard boxes and yellowed papers could protect me from the panic trying to destroy me. The day ended with a brief email from him. "Can we talk after work today?" I wanted to reply, "No," but I just typed yes. At 8 o'clock sharp, he was waiting for me at the same table he usually used on quieter afternoons. My steps felt heavy as I approached, and for a few seconds, all I felt was the fear of being rejected. "I know what you're thinking," he said as soon as I arrived. He looked away for a moment, then met my eyes again. "And no, you're not a distraction." I sat down without saying anything. "Rebecca is part of my history," he continued, "and denying that would be a lie. We almost got married, yes, but what we had died even before the official end happened. She came today to ask for explanations that maybe even she doesn't fully understand. And I gave them. I told her I met you, and that I don't want to go back to something that's already in the past." I swallowed hard. He reached his hand across the table. "James, I don't know everything you feel, and I can't imagine what it's like to experience the world the way you do. But I know what I felt with you that night, and all the other times we shared silences, glances, work, and presence. That was real for me." It took me a while to reply. Wild horses raced inside my chest. "Are you going to stay?" I asked. Benjamin didn't hesitate. He smiled a little with his eyes. "I already have." In that instant, something broke inside me. It was as if fear had been overcome by exhaustion. I no longer had the strength to play the self-saboteur I'd been since adolescence. I reached my hand across the table, touching his. No invading thoughts. Just warmth. Pure, human warmth. We left the library together that night. We walked slowly under the clear sky, the old university lampposts casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Our hands touched and didn't let go. Yes, he stayed. He stayed in everything. In Sunday mornings, in the passenger seat of my car, on the shelves we reordered together, in the new keychain next to mine at the apartment entrance. He stayed because choosing to be there is harder than simply leaving. And he chose me. Even when my whole life I thought no one ever would. Months have passed since that day. Spring finally brought its colors and that slight arrogance typical of a season that thinks it can replace winter. And it did. It replaced the cold with a gentle breeze. And in my case, loneliness with the presence of someone who insists on reminding me every day that I am alive. And I deserve to be. I still work at the library. Our paths continue to cross between shelves, glances, and discreet touches when no one is looking. Mrs. Lewis has figured it all out, of course. Ever since the first coffee Benjamin brought me in a Star Wars mug with James written on it by hand. We don't shout what we have. We live it. Maybe that's the most honest victory of all. Yes, I became an ex-virgin. Yes, it was with love. But more than that, it was with courage. The courage to show myself to the world without the fear of being too much or not enough. The courage to touch and be touched. Even with other people's thoughts echoing in my head. Even with the judgments, the silences, and the sideways glances. We're not perfect. We still stumble over words, insecurities, old shadows. But there's a foundation. There's truth. There's trust. And my bed, which used to be as cold as an Excel spreadsheet, now has Benjamin's warmth and messy hair on Sundays, the books left at the foot, and his scent clinging to my pillows. One day before bed, we lay side by side and he said, "Do you still hear what I think?" I smiled, half asleep. These days, I don't even need to anymore. The silence that followed was one of those complete ones. The kind where you don't need to say anything, because everything has already been said, lived, felt. Maybe true love is that. Comfortable silence and the sound of two breaths saying, "I'm staying." If you've made it this far, it's because something in this story resonated with you too. Because, deep down, everyone carries a piece of loneliness and an immense desire to be found. So, if you also believe in new beginnings, in improbable loves, and in the beauty of giving yourself over even when logic says otherwise, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and let me know in the comments if this story touched you in any way. What you hear here is just the beginning. The complete stories, unfiltered and with all the details you can imagine, are available now. Check the link in the description right away. The world keeps rushing outside, much faster than it should. But in here, between the books and our reinvented routines, I keep learning that love isn't the end of loneliness. It's the beginning of a new way of being with it, and this time, accompanied.